Thank you for being here, Abdel. It's great to have you here. And it's great to be here tonight. I guess my first question is that we say in describing this conference, right, that the Institute started with a simple belief. And I was wondering if you could take us back to the moment this belief first took form into your mind, what inspired it, what was going on in your brain that led you to create all of this?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for everyone here to be present. I'm truly delighted to be in Cambridge, such a historical city and a great university indeed. To be honest with you, I think the first belief was out of necessity. There was a huge gap in the market, and say, enough. If you look at the African Middle East context, there was very few think tanks, or at least very few research institutions that represented the interests of Africa and the Middle East internationally. I think that was the first steps towards something that was more meaningful. The second point was that I think you pointed this right, and I think just to clarify it for the audience, 70% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa is under 30. In the MEA region combined, you have 65% of the population is under 30. That's a game changer, and that's a comparative advantage for the region. I think not only natural resources, but then the human capital, the working capital, is the youth, and that is indeed the future. After it, I think the third element would have been hope. Hope for a better region, a more structured region, a forward-looking region that drive change and drive progress. And I think a year ago, year by year, I was with Ryan, our vice president here, was thinking about the idea and said, you know what, let's do something meaningful. And then the journey started. But then the idea was here for a few years on my side. And the journey started on the 22nd of February of this year at La Sorbonne, Paris, where we had a tremendous conference, 25 foreign delegation, 300 high-level attendees. That was something truly meaningful. And afterwards, in April, we really started work. So first, interview rounds, researcher. I think you do remember that moment quite well.
I remember that moment very well. That's when I got very happily recruited.
Of course, I think afterwards we really started working towards something that was more meaningful, that was more impact-driven. And I want you to remember this word, impact, because what we do at the MEA is truly impact. First, you led think tank. You've outlined it quite well in your presentation, but also a new framework in international relations, a new way to think about security, a new way to think about policy making, and also a way to engage youth into governance in a smart way. I think we do see that disparity, or at least different kind of disparities in Africa and the Middle East, and we just need to pinpoint the diversity of thought and the plurality that is inside the continent, whether it's Africa or the Middle East. So you have different regions, different worldview, and different, let's say, narrative. And the rationale to play alongside this sphere, or at least this area of powers and power dynamics, is complex. It's been a truly rewarding journey for myself, and I think most of the team here. But personally, I look forward to the future and look forward to what we can bring about.
Thank you. I think I can speak for everybody at MEA when I say that it has been an extremely rewarding journey. I remember when I first got started, I applied for a researcher position, and I ended up even leading a desk. I think that is one of the best things that the Institute does. It invests in youth, not only globally, not only for the MEA region, but also for the youth that is part of the Institute. Because I think your vision has truly recognized the value that we have. And I'm sure that nobody here doubts that, but I kind of want to ask you and poke you with this, because we all have these great ideas, right? We all think we can conquer the world. But at least personally, I have thousands of these a day, and then I never turn them into action because there's other options on the table that are easier, more traditional, more accepted. So what drove you and what motivated you to pursue this and to really place a bet into this project rather than going into consulting or a more traditional career, which I'm sure you could have achieved very well being a young academic at Birmingham, being an alumnus from the Sorbonne and from the University of Vienna, and with all your experience?
I think one word would summarize it quite well. It would be impact. And I think this is the word I want everyone here in the audience to remember. So sometimes you're driven more by what genuine impact you can make, or what kind of contribution you want to make in this world, rather than going into, I say, a path that is more financially good or at least stable for you. And say, it was always going outside of the comfort zone, not only for me, but most of our partners and most of the team members who say they were looking to do the other thing, to go above and beyond. And say, we have one really interesting case study, and it's actually our director of operation at MEA. And so he's got 5 years plus experience as a senior consultant in Deloitte. And well, he told me the story during his interview where he said, you know, Abdel, sometimes I want to pursue and drive meaningful change in my own ability, you know, how I can build something that is genuine and that is long term. And so he dropped out from Deloitte to join the Institute. And I think that's some of the examples that we have. We have actually many of them. Genevieve, actually, from South Africa, built up her experience from analyst, senior analyst to director, and now she's sitting at the executive board. So you're seeing this pattern, and say there's other people that are looking for impact. They're looking for I said genuine change, and also they've seen and embraced that vision. And that's something that we've been able to do across the 5 continents. And say we have the brightest minds on the planet, people from the Americas, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and even Asia, all working for the MEA region. And that's something truly, I mean, every time I think about it personally, I feel privileged, blessed, and also it gives me hope to the future. But then, you know, in every step in your professional career, one needs to see beyond himself or herself. And I think this is an important element. Of course, it's not something easy. It's not something easy to do. And in terms of work, you need to require, or at least this will require you to go above and beyond of your own, say, mental and physical capacities. I remember quite well in the very early beginnings of the Institute, where we were doing sleepless night. We were doing things that, you know, people can't imagine, really. And say it required a certain level of focus, of maturity, and also I think it just gives you a perspective where, sure, I think it's seeking and going outside of your comfort zone. But I think one of the triggers that really enabled me to pursue that path was, since a very young age, I knew what I wanted to do. One was my, say, kind of sports career, which, well, it's kind of be aside, but then the other one was always to make people happy. And in a sense where I think it gave me the ability to pursue my dream, but also contribute and give back to the community.
That is truly inspiring. I think I know the story about his sports career, and you'll have to hear it eventually, I think. But you've mentioned sleepless nights. You've mentioned putting in so much work at the beginning, which they haven't stopped doing, by the way, even if it's no longer the very beginning. But I guess I would like to know a bit more about how in this journey from vision to success, what was the greatest challenge, and maybe the most unexpected challenge that you had to face, and how did you overcome it?
I say one interesting thing in the beginning was to get people believing in what you're doing and what kind of vision you want to go into. And I say in the very beginning, I was actually, the first day was a year ago where I met personally Ryan in Paris randomly. I say, are you interested into doing this and this and this? This is, this is what we can do. These are the opportunities. And the most difficult thing is not to build it. I think this is a sustained effort, but most of the time, the energy goes into convincing people, creating and building consensus. And I really underline on that word consensus. Building consensus among people is something really challenging to do. And on my side, I think as soon as we had the funding team, it went smoothly. And so in terms of operations, we've moved from slightly over 9, 10 people in the beginning to now a community of 80 plus people across the world.
Wow.
And that's indeed something still tough to do. I say you have different time zones, you have different things to navigate, and also different sensitivities because you're really picking into very sensitive topics. Say what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in the Sahel, in Sudan right now. So you need to be careful about how you navigate these things, and also I think this is something really important to underline. You need to be able to work with everyone, wherever the fates, wherever say it's a different. You have different values and different fate within the team, and the region, the MEA region, represents that diversity. And so from day one, we've been able to work with different stakeholders, whether internally within the team and externally. And I think that was one of the main elements of the success of the institute, being able to build consensus, engage with all parties, and also make sure that we have impact on our research and on the ground.
That is very true. I think that the international nature of the institute is one of its greatest strengths, but it is an undeniable challenge at times. But I think the breadth of perspectives that we have is really what enables us to be so great. And you've mentioned that the institute engages with all stakeholders. Can you give us an example of what partners the institute has had recently, what projects you've taken on?
Sure. I think one of the most relevant examples was our reparation report, the MEA AUC reparation report, where we've submitted, I think, one of the best policy reports to the African Union Commission. I think that was some tremendous work that was put in from the team, and so one of the recommendation, I think, if we go into that specific research, it was about reparation. And so we looked at reparation on different lens. And so you had, of course, the historical background, also the final philosophical concept of a museum itself. And so when you talk about reparation, you talk also about museums and stuff. But also we've added a financial element where one of the key proposition of that policy report was an endowment fund for the African Union. And so we created an investment vehicle for the return of those artifacts that are in Europe. So Paris, London, Rome, Berlin, Brussels, to be channeled in this endowment fund, create dividends, and then those dividends will fund other youth programs. And so this is some of the ways, some smart ways to think about reparation. It's not only about giving back, but also being able to have sustainable returns and something that is long-term, generally impactful to the region and for its people.
Thank you. I think that is a great example of what we are doing at the MEA Institute and what we're trying to talk about here tonight. That's a great example of how to reform a narrative that has been controlled by, traditions and colonial legacies and those big boys in the big rooms that I was mentioning earlier. I guess on the theme of reforming narratives, right? There's a major breadth of misunderstandings regarding the MEA region. I think, sadly, we're still stuck in a lot of old frameworks in both academia and policy and public conceptions. What do you think is the biggest misconception in this sense? If you had to single out one, I know it's difficult, but I have to challenge you.
Interesting question, but I'd like to channel it back into some of the historical background and say why why MEA, why Middle East and Africa. And I say that there's different variables involved in it. I'd like to provide a bit of historical background, so I say the rationale could be seen and understood in the right way. So both regions have been connected since biblical times, shared values, shared heritage, history sometimes, but also shared interest. And I think this combination makes both region special, very important to what would be, for sure, I think, the 21st century, but then most importantly, the 22nd century, because if we look forward into the future, we have still 75 years to go to attain that 22nd century. But I think Africa and the Middle East will be one of the world's major powers in the future. With that said, you have a bunch of opportunities, but internally, you have different sorts of challenges. Whether it's if we touch upon history, you had a colonial legacy that is undeniable, and so the concept of a nation state itself is also problematic because you have a continent or a region that have different governing style that doesn't necessarily, the Western side doesn't necessarily match with what people used to have. And I think it's an important element. One of the things as well, not only in governance, but the way, or at least the way the region perceive the word. And I think you have an element where a lot of communities have a very simplistic, very humble view of the word, which is not predominantly dominant or expansionist, imperialistic, but more or less being self-sufficient, self-sustainable. And so you have an approach to security, an approach to a prosperity that is different from what we have here in Europe. And I think diversity, of course, plays a lot. History plays a lot. But to come back into your question, I think one of the most prominent challenges that the region face will be governance. And so this generation will be about good governance, will be how we can find the ways and means to make sure that the right people are in the right position, not to change, not to inflict change, but then to have impact. And say the moment that we think of change, which is, it's a big word, and say change. But I think if we narrow down our perspective into having impact into what we do, we'll be able to attain much more far superior results than we'll have when we say change. And so therefore, to have change, you need impact. And I think you have this element, sure, but if you go back into some of the challenges that I see personally happening in the region, say there is a lack of consensus that could be mentioned. There is a lack of infrastructure in terms of, well, if we talk about AI, data centers, a lot can be drawn out. I think one of the most important thing will be consensus. Say, being able to create consensus, to create more integration, but also to make sure that there is a sustainable future to both regions, and say, getting consensus done, and then afterwards working towards policies that are actually impactful.
Absolutely, absolutely. You've touched upon how this is all about good governance, eventually, and you've also mentioned that youth needs to step it up, and we will be defining who is in governance, what they do, if we manage to build that consensus, right? We are seeing the beginning of that throughout the world. We're seeing Gen Z and youth overall rising up, taking to the streets to reclaim that space. We've seen protests in Nepal, but also in Morocco, Madagascar. This is happening massively in a region. We've had Forbes recently has highlighted in particular that in the Middle East, the Gen Z is reforming leadership in the region. So I guess my question to you is, what are the key opportunities of this in practice? What steps do you think youth needs to take to go from, let's say, the streets to the actual governing halls? And what risks are there along the way? What could be the pitfalls in this process?
Right. I think the first perspective to start with, and I think that's the rationale driven by the youth today. So you're a policymaker or a policy taker. And starting from this perspective, you draw the line and you see a pattern. You've talked about Nepal, Indonesia, Madagascar, Morocco, Peru, and so it's not only a regional trend, but it's a trend that we're seeing through Global South, and that inflicts a fight for good governance. Now, in terms of policy in the short term, I think this will have consequences in the short term, but then I think for most of the region, most of the countries, we'll see a transition, but then you'll be able to see change through a period of 5 to 15 years. And so what we'll be seeing now is a maintain or at least a slight evolution of the status quo in terms of progression and so on. But then for this change or for this transition to happen, it will require time. And so 5 to 15 years seems a lot for a human life, but then country-wise, it's nothing. It's peanuts.
That's true.
And therefore, one of the pitfalls that may see, I think that there is a foreign intervention, I say element here, and it's an important variable. There may be, if we think about regime change or a change in government through all other means, say people may drive or may think they're doing the right thing, but then it could be the opposite. And say sometimes you need to be careful on how you see things, how you're doing it, but also I say as soon as you have structured movement that is genuine and that is here for impact, you will have all the factors, all the elements for it to succeed. If you don't have certain elements aligned, there will be, I'd say, a backward trend that could be observed. But then I am optimistic and seeing those movement, but also I remain very much careful for what's forward, because it needs to be structured and strategy needs to be involved here.
Absolutely. I guess it's all about consensus once again, right? And organization. And I think to some degree, it's also not only about consensus within the movements, but across the continent. You've touched upon some of the limits of nation states as we know them. I mean, at the end of the day, nation states were designed in the 17th century to answer to a European problem. So I guess, what are they doing outside of Europe, we wonder sometimes. And we see that a lot these days with issues that go way beyond the sphere and the capacity of nation states to handle them, from displacement crisis to global jihadist movements to illegal trade flows, human trafficking to mobility issues. I guess, what alternatives are there? Are there any alternatives in your view? How can this situation be improved?
Well, it's if the questions go into the style of governance, I think if it is the case, I think historically speaking, there was alternatives that were here. So in the Islamic world, you have something called Majlis al-Shura, which means actually it's kind of a House of Lords or a Senate's floor, where some of the sheikh, or at least people that have certain wisdoms, go sit at the table and then decide and create consensus on what's best for society. So you have that tribal system. In, for example, West Africa and East Africa, you have a different style of governance. And so you have tribes organizing themselves, very religious, very conservative, this will depend, but there is no good or bad style of governance. There is, if if the system is efficient for the people, I think this is what should be undertaken. But I think we'll still see the nation state, that this will remain. It's a legacy. It's not something that could be changed. There could be reform into government to at least adapt policy making, or at least try to fit certain element of policy making into certain tribe, into certain places. We know that, for example, in very rural areas in the Sahara, North Africa, for example, the concept of nation state doesn't exist. Right. And so you have the Tuareg, certain nomad tribes that have their own style of governance. Say the law itself doesn't apply to them. And it may be shocking to hear, but then they work completely fine. And they have their own governing system that work directly with the nation state itself. So we're seeing this kind of collaboration between certain tribes, between certain communities, and the state itself. I think this could be a solution to find, or at least resolve certain conflicts and challenges. If we take the case of the Sahel, you have 6 major tribes that can be traced to a chief tribe, and that chief have a control. And they meet every year in Timimun, in a city in Algeria, and so they have different rendezvous together every year to discuss issues and say, how do we make sure that we organize ourselves for trade? How we can resolve a conflict in the Sahel, notably in northern Mali, in Niger, in Chad. And so we've seen this trend of cooperation between local communities, a tribe system, and the state itself. So it could be an example. Same thing in the Middle East. But I think a friend of mine, I was discussing with him a few months ago, say, what's the problem in terms of security? And say, what's the fundamental cause of challenges, not only in the MEA region, but then across the world? I said one word: ego. And it's, I think with that word, we can draw an analysis that is very genuine and say people have the tendency of, say, hating or at least challenging say, one party over the other, which shouldn't be the case. But coming back to the topic, I think we're seeing that dual style of policy making. There is mechanisms that are in place. The African Union is also doing some interesting work, not that efficient. I think it could be more efficient, more strengthened. But then I think we're seeing a pattern that could be a possible solution to a new, at least alternative style of governance without changing the concept of state itself.
No, it's amazing. I think sometimes the most innovative ideas, the most base ideas are those that take us back to where we were before we alienated a lot of what was natural and what worked, right? You've touched upon the African Union. Now, with all of this growth of transnational issues, since we're admitting that the nation states are not going anywhere anytime soon, as they are, I guess we should be looking towards stronger regional cooperation, right? That would be the automatic assumption. But some of the cooperation frameworks that we see in the Middle East and in Africa don't have the best track record of being effective. How do you think they can improve? What do you think should be the focus on how to improve these partnerships, how to get more cohesiveness and more impact out of this?
Well, it's all about building consensus. And I think the smartest investment you can make now is investing in the youth, and say youth is a comparative advantage, and say, well, usually you have 3 trends vis-a-vis how the government or the states see youth. So either as a political tool, an economic tool, or I'd say an instrument of transition. I say, meaning I want to invest because this is the new generation, and say we need to invest in them, and we want a better future for our country or our region, and so on. And so you either have this rationale, or the first two that I mentioned, which are intertwined. So the economic part and the political part. Political part for election mainly, to say we saw, and the region, especially the MENA region and Africa as well, is very famous for that. We see a peak in youth investment a year or at least 6 months before election campaign. And you see it in the media, you see it depending on the kind of PR work you see outside. Also, youth programs increasing, social civil society also making a contribution, and also social services going on, showing up the youth. So you have this two rationale that are used. But I want to focus into investing into the next generation and say, making sure that we transmit rather than we change the system and say, at MEA, I don't think we are revisionist. I don't think we are. We are reformists. And so that means that we work hands in hands with government to make sure that young people and the youth, young professionals, have a place at the table in policy making. And that's super important. Making sure that there is diversity in governance. And that's add a lot of plurality. You find innovative ideas and say, one way or the other. And I think an example that, just to come back to an example that I've mentioned earlier, say the idea about an endowment fund, in talking about reparation. Usually that's a topic that is not taboo. I'd say this is very interesting, and there is a certain heritage, there is certain respect when talking, when discussing it. But then you can't actually come up with these solutions if you don't know how to involve the youth. And therefore the question is not to either invest or not, or not, because investing in the youth is an imperative. And say the main question to us and say, how can I make sure that youth are in the table? And so investing is one thing, and making sure the youth is on the table, negotiating, making sure that it has a future. And again, the youth is a majority in most of the countries: Nigeria, Algeria, Ethiopia, Senegal, the Gambia. So most of the population is under 30, and they should have a seat.
Absolutely, absolutely. You've mentioned again the endowment. I think this is a really interesting concept, because this gives a little bit of more concreteness, right, to this idea of investment. What do you envision would be a kind of project or a kind of investment that concretely this endowment could fund? Can you tell us a bit more about how this idea came to be, and how you break it down into an actual policy, and also an initiative that you personally, as a youth leader, you would have liked your government to implement?
That's the second one is a tough one, because you're going to be very sensitive here. But I think one thing I'd like to see, to answer your question very straightforward, is in involving and seeing youth as the main actor towards a good society. And not as a political tool or a tool itself. Seeing it as a comparative advantage rather than anything else. And I think that with just the mindset change, I think we'll see much more progress towards the region. You've talked about cooperation, just to follow up and finish the idea. Creating consensus enables the region to create more, or at least strengthen regional ties within itself first, but then also internationally with Europe, America, the Indo-Pacific, where we're seeing new partnership being forged with the youth. And so having projects that are created by youth for youth is also something really interesting. And so to conclude on it, bottom line, youth is the future, 100% of it, but then the advantages behind it and the opportunities that open up for young people are also important to consider. Now, if we draw upon the line to the African Union, I think on a continent, I think the trend needs to come from a continental body. I think you do have the national rationale, you do have that national pride, say a certain sort of patriotism, but also nationalism that can go a little bit extreme. But then having those trends being shared and being discussed on a continental level is also important. And so the African Union have a role in it. It needs to be reformed. It needs to be complemented. But also, this is where we come in as MEA. Strategy is lacking in the region. And to create consensus, to create these, at least the ecosystem to enable us to inflict that impact, that generally speaking, you need good people, the right people sitting at the table, discussing policies and making sure they get it done. But without that space, without that ecosystem, it will be very difficult to inflict that change. And that's what the think tank ecosystem is all about. So you have four spheres of power: the economic sphere, the political sphere, the media sphere, and the knowledge creation sphere. And so the institute is right at the center of it. You have different electrons sorting, and we have at least a certain level of influence over each field and each sphere of power, which enable us to play with different power dynamics. And so it becomes easier for the policymaker, between brackets, to have good policies, because usually it's very technocratic. There's a lot of bureaucracy in it, and without these spaces, without a certain, or at least this manner of critically thinking about policy, it will be very hard, not only for the AU, but then all member states, and including the Middle East, to find concrete and innovative solutions to make it happen, or at least have a sort of impact, generally speaking.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that was a very comprehensive answer. I think I wish I had gotten that in one of my lecture at some point.
Thank you.
No, it's great, and I think this is one of the big values of what we do, right? We take that knowledge creation into our own hands, but still somehow there's often a little bit of a gap, right? We have many youth organizations who have gorgeous ideas and create beautiful knowledge, and that just doesn't get recognized. How, I guess because the Institute has reached some amazing successes, right? We've gotten to the African Union, we're engaged with policymakers, we have some very exciting trips upcoming that if you want to share, I'm sure that would be great news. How do you bridge that gap? How do you make sure kind of you're taken seriously that? And you can speak about this on both an institutional level and on a personal level as a young person who's in these big rooms. How do you do that?
Well, it's all about creating that ecosystem that would enable us, or at least would have a certain impact into different groups, talking about government, stakeholders, young people. And so it's all about getting people into the table and understanding that together we go far. Alone, we may go fast, but then together we go far. And I think
I'm going to be stealing that quote, by the way.
And to be honest with you, frankly, the idea of a think tank itself is to gather policymakers, is to gather business leaders, young people, and make sure that after certain meetings, after roundtables, after conferences like ours, we come up with concrete solution that would deliver to the region, whether locally or internationally. One thing that we need to understand also, and I said this earlier, we're not revisionist, we're reformist. And understanding that, especially I said this to our international stakeholders. So if you lose 20% of market share in X area, you'll gain 20% of market share using our methodology, a win-win approach through cooperation, a different lens into seeing, say, whether or doing trade, business, or any kind of involvement. And so we need to see and we need to think differently, whether from a foreign perspective or a local perspective, an MEA perspective. And that's the key idea we want to share, is that for it to happen, there needs to be a certain level of awareness, but also consensus. And then also, again, important word for it to happen. But it's all about getting people from everywhere, all stakeholders, into the table, having dialogue, and making sure that the deliverables are genuinely for the greater good of the region.
That's amazing. And I guess once you start having successes and once you show that you can do it, the journey is exponential. The sky's the limit, right? So I guess we should be wrapping this up soon, but I have two more questions for you.
Sure.
The first one is, it's been a little over 6 months since the launching of the Institute. That's very short. We've already had many great successes. What are we looking ahead to? Both in the short term, I want to say the next 6 months, and then in the more medium, long term, let's say, give me a 5 year. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? That's a daunting, usual question.
Well, frankly, I think it will be a complete scale up of our overall capabilities first. So making sure that we scale up research, making sure that we're able to afford, or at least have that financial sustainability in our processes, because most of our researchers today are volunteer. We take a lot of people, lots of researchers from across the world to do interesting and genuine work that, you know, it's, I said this to our team the other day, say it's good to have an essay written about Kenya to deliver to your university assignments. But then, you know, I'll better prefer sending it to the African Union to be implemented. And so there's a huge difference for researcher, young academics, what I want to call them, between university work and also the work they can do generally being involved with us. So it's a dual opportunity, and it's a dual relationship, one not only of an employee, but then a true partner. And that's how we see our team members at the Institute, as genuine team members, sure, but also genuine partners. Now, how how do I see personally the Institute in the coming months and few years? I think there will be lots of travel, lots of engagement, much more reports, much more. I think it's a sustained effort to build greater partnerships. We're in close. We're really in close consultation with the African Union to have our first MOU submitted and hopefully soon signed in Addis Ababa. In 2 weeks from now, we're going to the UN high level meeting in New York. So if any one of you wants to is going to be around New York, please come say hi. But the agenda is looking packed. In mid-December, we have a conference at the Algerian Senate. And hopefully between March and April, we'll have our first conference in the GCC. So it will be in Abu Dhabi in cooperation with the government, over there. But much more partnerships, much more impact, and I say a renewed vision and commitment towards the region, and a great willingness to work with all parties, whether locally and internationally, towards something that is more meaningful, that is prosperous, and that is win-win. But I think on a technical level, there's lots to talk about. I think Ryan will be more confident and more, I think, performance to talk about it than me. But yeah, I think in a nutshell, that's how we see ourselves. And to conclude, I think we're going to be one of the most, or at least predominant, think tank in the Middle East and Africa. Mark my words, MEA is going to be one of the greatest think tank in the region and the world. So it's going to require lots of work, lots of effort, but then we're quite confident in our ability to do it.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm also quite confident, and my passport is ready, so I'm ready to travel at your word. Just one last question, if I may. What personal advice would you give to somebody who also has these kinds of ideas, who wants to be a youth leader, who has so much potential, but maybe doesn't know where to start? I surely didn't know a few years ago what to do.
Engagement. So engage, try as much as you can. I think I generally mean this to say trying something to, or at least trying to build something is difficult. It's going to be challenging. It's going to require a certain level of energy and contribution from your side. But I think have faith, engage, and do, or at least try at your best of your ability to not only have change, but then have impact. One of the things I would advise is I personally usually do this, and I come from a sports background, so I'd like to challenge myself on a personal level and say trying different things would enable me at a younger age, have enable me personally to move towards at least a better person. I'm still evolving, and starting with the perspective that you don't forcefully know everything, but then that you know nothing. Open doors. And then the more you know, the more that you understand that you don't know much. And I think that's a good perspective. And say learning, getting educated into different fields, being able to at least take from a bit from the economics, a bit from politics, a bit from law, a bit from medicine, sociology, philosophy. And I think this would give you the intellectual capability to at least direct yourself and direct a career. But one thing that I would advise is try, and have faith in the journey.
Those are some inspiring words to close on. I guess we can open it up for a few questions. If anybody in the audience has something they would like to know more from Abdel.